Suketu Gandhi is a partner in the Kearney consultancy, and we're going to have a discussion today about a new COVID stress test for company resilience. Hello, Suketu. How are you?
Hello, Robert. Wonderful talking to you.
So you've developed a resilience stress test. I understand it has 8 dimensions and 51 variables. Is that correct? It sounds pretty complex.
Yes, and it started out really thinking about what has worked during these crises and how do you react to them. And went back to the 2008-9 crisis where the financial sector was hit quite hard, and the stress test that they built has stood the test of time quite well. The second thing that was pushing, and we were thinking about it for the last 9 months, was the trade skirmishes and the conversations and folks and genuinely boards and CEOs talking about the fact that supply chains are absolutely critical as consumer trends change, as geography changes, as technology changes. And that's how we stepped back and looked at this thing called the resiliency stress test. And it has become, in the last 5 months, as you know very well, a common topic. How do we get resilient?
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, we don't have time to go through 8 dimensions and 51 variables, but I'd like to cover some of the main ones, if I may. Starting with geography, how does geography relate to company resilience?
Absolutely. So you picked on a really good one. Geography is an interesting one because what it does is it asks you what is the distance between where you make and where you sell. It forces you to understand. For example, you might have big markets in India, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, where the consumers buy your products as well as you make them. So that has a different level of implication. But if you find that you are in a situation where it's primarily an export-driven market for you, where things are made and then sent to the other part, then you may look at resiliency slightly differently. Even in markets where you have both a good tie between where you make and where you sell, you still want to have the ability to have other sources that can make this. And that's why we brought the element of geography, which was typically ignored for cost. Cost had been the primary driver, and this brings a different element to the table.
Ignored until a disaster happened in that particular geography. But this is obviously more complex than simply saying, well, China is a risk because of that's where the virus first came up. And so you're talking about it could be any country where a company is single sourced and thereby creating more risk to its supply chain. Which leads us into this whole question. It's a related question or a related factor as well, and that is variability or multiplicity of suppliers. Do you believe that simply by virtue of having a single supplier situation, you are putting your supply chain at risk?
Not necessarily. Because if you had a large supplier, for example, right, some of the great manufacturers of electronic items that are primarily on the West Coast, they have a lot of single supplier models. But what they've done is really worked with them to understand who the tier 2 and tier 3s are. So companies generally do a great job of understanding tier 1, but it's the tier 2 and tier 3 that really kill them. An example would be a zipper manufacturer on a backpack. We had a client where that became a #1 gating issue, where they couldn't get materials or products made and shipped to US and Europe because it was the zipper manufacturer. We've heard about and actually seen examples like capacitors. They are a penny a piece, but there are very few of them. So what is important is to take your product, decompose it down, and understand where the risks are, and use some of the other levers to protect yourself, like money.
Yeah. Do you think this might constitute the first opportunity for some companies to even discover who their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers are? Do some of them just not know, have clear visibility?
Won't take names, but in the last, 4 months, I've done about 400, talked to about 400 or so clients. And it is fascinating when you go down into detail with these folks and you find out that they really don't know. They really don't know because either they didn't have the manpower or they didn't have the technology, or you know what? Hey, it's been going on for 100 years. It will continue for the next 50. Was the assumption.
Yeah. Now, this next one might seem obvious, but for the fact that, as you say, if companies were exclusively looking at labor costs, they might have overlooked what some of us might think is obvious, an obvious factor, and that is flexible manufacturing, transport, and distribution factors. So what do we need to know about that now to bring that into the discussion and have that be an important indicator of resilience?
So you brought up a really interesting point, because you merged three things that need to be taught together. And that's actually the power of this resiliency stress test. We look at all of these individual elements, but when they come together, are you more resilient or not, right? It's like, my heart's working fine, my liver's working fine, but I got a lousy lung. And you know what? You are at risk. So when we combine manufacturing with transportation, what it does is two things. One is, it says, again, back to the geography, where are you making it and how easily can it make it to the consumer or your customer? That's one part. Second, you might want to have backup manufacturing in different locations. Now, having a backup manufacturing, but if you don't have the transportation network to meet the demand or meet the consumer, doesn't help you. And then the last thing that comes in is, folks spend a lot of time in manufacturing making really high-end factories, but they are again governed by the ability of the spare parts to come in, or the sub-assemblies, subcomponents to come in and make the product. So understanding that inbound and outbound in conjunction with manufacturing is where you get true resilience.
One area where companies might have learned their lesson in the last few months is the tendency of ocean carriers across the Pacific to simply cancel sailings, so that you thought you were on a particular ship and now you're not. Not a new practice particularly, but it's been pretty rampant lately. So I wonder if that also puts that idea of distribution risk, transportation risk, a little bit more front and center in supply chain executives' minds these days.
That's a, you know what, that's a wonderful example of where, folks weren't thinking about it. There were plenty of ships. You could look at the Baltic Index and figure out that there was plenty of stuff. The other example where that came up was actually the belly of the beast. That is the commercial aircraft that were flying people, also used to carry a lot of goods, which were higher value. And as soon as those stopped, you lost significant portion of your capacity that was high speed. So you are right, with the ship and with air, these have turned out to be genuine weak links in your network.
Yeah. Any others in particular? I mean, we just hit about 3 or 4 major ones out of your dimensions of your stress test. Any others that you think bears mention in this brief conversation?
A quick one would be a product and your product platform, which is, how well do you understand how your product is built? What are the features that really matter to the consumer or customer? And is there a way to make it differently? And I'll give you a for example. We have worked with some fairly large, let's say, equipment manufacturers that had about 1,000 pieces that went into building it. But the features that they brought out, half of them were not necessary. And so now you are bringing complexity in your manufacturing. Your underlying product platform is vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And it costs more. So that's one of the techniques that we've looked at in terms of product platform, on how your platforms are designed to switch. And a simple example that has worked out well are kind of alcohol manufacturers who started switching and making hand sanitizers. So that is another example of your underlying platform having the flexibility to do other things.
When you talk about elements of complexity, they're not necessary. Not necessary according to whom? It's determined by the customer who's using the product, or what goes into making the product? What do you mean by not necessary exactly?
Yeah, it is. We focus primarily on the customer. Mm-hmm. That does the customer value what you're bringing to the table? And if they don't, then don't put it in, right? It mm-hmm. does not add value. Now, there might be a resiliency component, and I'll give you an example, right, which was kind of well known. When Tesla turned on their software that allowed people to get out of Florida in a hurricane and increase the range at which they were able to go. Right. Now, that's resiliency that is built in. And imagine if you were a Tesla owner in Florida, you love Elon for that one. But that's, again, building things into the platform that you can understand if the customer needs, and if not, would they need in the future. thinking about resiliency of the product and the usage by customer is a critical element that we think is differentiated.
Interesting. Maybe this concept of delighting the customer can be taken a little bit too far, to the point where you're over delighting them. I know that it's almost impossible to generalize among different companies, industries, supply chains, but I wonder if there is a kind of a common Achilles heel that time and time again is revealed as companies undertake this review with your resilience test.
The one common thing that we are seeing across industries, and now we've done quite a few across quite a broad swath of global companies. The number one thing is planning. Folks always thought that they were going to plan and pray, and that model hasn't worked. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about is a sense and pivot model that says you are sensing what is happening both from a supply side as well as a demand side, and then adjusting your plans. Instead of thinking about in terms of, first it used to be years, then it was months, weeks. Now you almost think about it daily, and how do I adjust? Mm-hmm. And this pivoting element is where you're bringing flexibility to your transportation network, your manufacturing network, your supplier base, and your financials. So that is a big, consistent theme we are seeing across. And, if I was going to be bold, I'd say just about every planning function in supply chain is going to be redone in the next 3 years.
And there's never been a better time to think about it. Thanks to, if we can thank COVID-19 at all, it might be because of this, but I'm sure that our listeners and viewers would like to know more about this, delve deeper into this COVID-19 resilience test. All we have time for at the moment, though. Suketu Gandhi of Kearney, thanks very much for talking to us about it. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Robert. It was a pleasure.